Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Climate Justice in Canadian Parks. My name is Stephanie Stanov. I'm a project manager here at Park People, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's webinar. We have such an incredible lineup of panelists, but before we dive right into a conversation with our speakers, we have a few things that we'd like to share to sort of frame our conversation today. So for those of you who are hearing about Park People for the first time, our work focuses on helping people to activate the power of parks and improve quality of life in cities across Canada. We offer comprehensive support to grassroots community groups, nonprofits, municipal staff, and more across the country that are working to animate and enhance their local parks. And I'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. So we'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging the land that we're gathered on and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of all. The land acknowledgement that I'm reading today has been formulated for Toronto specifically, where the head office of Park People sits. However, please remember that a land acknowledgement is a personal reflection of who you are and your relationship to the land on which you find yourself, and thus your responsibility to that land. So with this in mind, if you're located anywhere that is not Toronto, I encourage you to make this land acknowledgement personal to you. So Park People acknowledges that the land they call home sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We hope that this land acknowledgement invites us all to reflect on the ongoing colonial injustices in our park systems and bring that awareness to our conversation today. I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your municipality, and what nation's territory you're joining us from. If you don't know which nation's territory you live or work in, we encourage you to visit nativeland.ca or Whose Land, both of which will be shared in the chat window, and both websites share the territories of Indigenous peoples across the world and are a great tool for learning and exploration. So today's discussion stems from our research in our Canadian City Parks report that we released in June 2021. The CCPR, as we call it, tracks trends and challenges in city parks, as well as how cities are rising to address those challenges. This was the third year of the report, and we're already working on some really great content for you and for 2022. And the goal of the report is to share Canadian practices, establish this common sort of database, and inspire action. In the 2021 report, we included a feature on how cities are addressing climate resilience through parks and the impacts climate change is having on our cities' green spaces. In particular, we looked at how cities can sort of better integrate a climate justice perspective into this work in recognition that access to quality green spaces and the climate resilience of those spaces, such as reduced temperature and stormwater capture, are not always equitably distributed across our cities. So today's panelists will help us to break down that inequity and talk about how cities and communities can move forward in thinking more justly about climate resilience and city parks. We'd like to thank the Weston Family Foundation in making the report possible, not only this year, but for the past 3 years. And we'd also like to acknowledge the RBC Foundation for supporting the special climate change section of this report. And so with that, today we're going to be covering quite a few big and incredibly important topics. So we know that parks and green spaces in cities help to mitigate the impacts of climate change by reducing temperatures and lowering flood risk and so much more. And some neighborhoods, however, have unequal access to these spaces, leaving lower income or racialized communities much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And these impacts are felt today. In our conversation, we'll talk about how addressing these inequities involves not only thinking about a more equitable distribution of green space, but also changes in how we engage and involve our communities in the design, planning, and maintenance of our city's parks. So to introduce our incredible panelists, today we have with us Larissa Crawford, the founder and managing director of Future Ancestors Services, which is an Indigenous and Black-owned, youth-led professional services social enterprise that advances climate justice and equity with lenses of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. Larissa is a restorative circle keeper, published Indigenous and anti-racism researcher, an award-winning ribbon skirt artist, among many other things. We have Dr. Laurie Nesbitt, assistant professor in the Department of Urban Forestry at the University of British Columbia, where her research focuses on urban forestry and social ecological interactions in urban environments, with an emphasis on environmental justice, human health, well-being, and climate change. During her career, she's had the privilege to work with communities and organizations across Canada and internationally to achieve sustainability and environmental justice goals. And finally, Zamani Ra, the founder of Seed Canada, a not-for-profit environmental education organization that provides tools and resources to residents and property owners in social housing communities. Zamani is a skilled environmental educator and community organizer with over 20 years of experience in community capacity building. So I'm super eager to get into our conversations, but just to highlight the format of this webinar, we want to keep it very conversational, like a good chat between friends. And while we won't be doing a formalized Q&A session, we will be monitoring the chat for any sort of recurring questions that come up, and we might throw those to the panelists. So the first question I'd like to ask to all three speakers, but we'll start off with Zamani. What does the term climate justice mean to you, especially in the context of city parks? And how does this show up specifically in the work that you do?
Hi, Stephanie. Okay, so thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here. I see some very familiar faces and some names I haven't seen in a very long time. So I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I'm just really grateful to be among the panelists. I think, so for climate justice, I've actually, when I think about this question, it's easier for me to answer what climate injustice rather than what climate justice is. Because I think we're still, depending on the communities you come from and where you live, breathe, and how you experience the spaces you live in, I think we're still defining what climate justice is. But in terms of climate injustice, I think for me, it's probably easier to define it in that way. It's really an unbalanced approach to how we're looking at the spaces we live in. So I think a lot about benefits versus the burden, and who's carrying it, the weight of it, and who is, even though we're sort of all in this together, we don't all experience the same effects in the same way. So I think a lot about the macro conversation, so this global conversation about, about climate and who it affects and whatnot. I actually think that same global context is very, can be broken down into a very individual lens and scope. So when we look, for example, at what's happening across the continent of Africa, when you think about droughts and you think about floods in places that normally don't drought and flood during those times, and disrupting food planning, all that kind of stuff, all the way to what happened in Haiti, what happened with Katrina like 16 years ago, and then even what happens locally here. So when we talk about the ice storm, who got affected, when we think about people in communities who are overburdened with the responsibility of addressing what they need to do climate change wise. So I think that's really what I think about when I think about climate injustice.
Great, thank you for that. I really appreciate how you touched on this idea of the global to local scale. And we often think about climate change as being this, big picture thing that happens across the world and maybe not in our cities specifically. But we are seeing these impacts show up in our cities and in our parks. So I appreciate that comment. Mm-hmm. Lorien, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much for the nice introduction and for your thoughts, Zamani. So my name is Laurie Nesbitt. I'm an assistant professor of urban forestry at UBC. And UBC is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation and has been a part of knowledge sharing for many, many generations. I'm today working from home. So I'm on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And understanding that has been part of my learning about climate injustice, I guess, over the past year. Typically, my research program is around urban green inequities, and that's increasingly sort of intersecting with extreme heat and experiences of extreme heat. But more recently, I've sort of learned more about the ways that climate injustice also ties into colonialism, and I think a lot of people don't realize how that operates in urban space as well. So often we see Indigenous resistance outside of cities, and people think of it as something that's far away. And I just kind of wanted to highlight, I guess, drawing on from the land acknowledgement, that there are Indigenous land defenders in Vancouver, in Burnaby, in our urban parks, who are resisting the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example. And I think that's a really important part of climate injustice. It's like this intersection of sort of communities experiencing the impacts of climate change in an inequitable way, as well as not being responsible for those impacts, and then not being allowed to defend against those impacts either, right? So they're being criminalized on their land when they're trying to engage in something that would help us move away from the climate crisis that we're in. And so I just kind of want people to start thinking about what how that happens in urban space as well. Like, we all are living on unceded territories, and that's part of why climate injustice is also an issue of colonialism and Indigenous subjugation. That's something that I'm just learning about. So others could talk about that more fully. I think I know a little bit more about just the ways in which our urban forests are inequitably distributed, so that those who have more wealth and privilege typically have more of that shade, typically have more access to parks, typically also have more access to housing where they can get cooling, right? And so we need to think about how different systems work with each other to reproduce inequities. And then the other thing that I think is important to highlight about climate injustice is that those who are experiencing the most impacts and have less opportunities to adapt using the natural systems in our cities are also less able to control those spaces. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more, but taking control of what's happening in our parks and making them welcoming spaces so that they are places we want to go and escape from that heat, and where we can have the time to recreate.
Thank you. Larissa, over to you. What does the term climate justice mean to you, and how does this show up in your work?
Hey, dansé, bon matin. Larissa Crawford, Dishnik, Ashen, Calgary, Ken, Pimi, Famille, Penitente, Guishi, Peach, Jamaica, Nikan. Bonjour, matin, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. Je sais que cette conversation est en anglais, mais si vous voulez faire des commentaires en français, des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, faites-le. I'm Larissa, and it's just, it's more culturally appropriate for me to introduce myself and just to acknowledge I carry Métis ancestry from Penetangee, Ontario, and Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. And I pass this on to my 4-year-old daughter, Zyra. And I really like this question because I think about it so often, and we talk about it so often in the work that I do at Future Ancestor Services. And I kind of want to respond to this in 2 ways, in terms of how I understand how climate justice implicates my life and how I do my work in climate justice. It's really caused me to think about my relationship to land and reclaiming that and honoring that as valuable. In my personal experience, that is climate justice. I lived in Toronto for several years, and I had a lot of anxiety. And it took a lot of elder hours and therapy to really understand it was that disconnection from access to land. I'm from Calgary, I'm from the mountains. And so that disconnection and not making time to be on the land had pretty severe implications on my health. And so for me, when I think about climate justice and just the way that I exist and the way that I do my work, it means making time to honor that relationship to land and to be intentional about that relationship and to hold space in my work and our work to honor that. And so at Future Ancestor Services, when we asked this question, it looked like, okay, how can we strategically plan to work with the seasons? And so we've totally restructured our organization where now we plan our events, we plan our kind of organizational movement with the energy we feel as the seasons cycle through. And when we want to and need to be on the land more. And so it's been really interesting to see that just structurally how that's held more space for us to honor our relationship to land and still hold space for work. And then 4-day work weeks. I don't work on Mondays, and I make sure that I go on the land on those Mondays and that I honor that relationship to land. So again, just positioning that personal spiritual relationship that we can and do all have to land and water. To me, that's what climate justice looks like in my everyday life. And I'm going to send a post. I'm going to share some posts in the chat. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I just want to share a resource because, again, I think about this a lot. And we put together a resource at Future Ancestor Services called Honoring Relationship to Land in an Urban Environment. And so if you kind of want to dive deeper into this idea of relationship to land, check out this post. It's a really cool little action-oriented post. The second piece that I want to speak to is, again, climate justice is the vision of the communities, and it's going to look different. As Zamani really highlighted, it's going to look different everywhere. And so I think that while a vision of climate justice can look different, I'd say that it's a requirement, whatever that vision is, that understanding of climate justice is contextualized, especially in colonial history and pre-colonial history, in our contemporary realities. And I'm just pulling a post that I made when the report came out, right after the Sharing the Benefits of Green Spaces came out from Park People. And there was a really interesting tidbit from the Indigenous Climate Action Summit. And they said, if the city does not account for and address colonization in its policies, it will keep repeating the same problematic behaviors. And I think that really underscores the importance of making sure that the work that we're doing, whether we think it's relevant or not, that we have the capacity to contextualize it, to understand intentions behind it, to understand how we got here. And I'll just wrap up by saying, sharing this last post. And this post I recently made amid so much state-sanctioned violence that's going on in BC right now, with logging, with pipeline construction. And it just shocks me that so many people don't understand how interrelated resource extraction, land theft is to so many other adversities and issues that we see in this world. And I'll wrap up with this. Whether it was their homeland or the new land forced upon them, land held in common gave people strength. It gave them something to fight for. And so in the eyes of the federal government, that belief was a threat. When we have and know this history and know these truths, we come to this work, we come to policymaking, we come to strategic planning with a very different capacity to empathize and capacity to really seek out just and sustainable futures for our parks. And again, this was underscored by Indigenous climate action and for the sharing the benefits of green space. So when I think about climate justice, these are kind of the two ways that I most regularly think about it. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Larissa, for that, and really talking about, reclaiming your connection to the land as a space and a tool for healing. I think that's a really important sort of concept to set up our conversation today too. And for sharing those resources. And not so shameless plug, if you want to follow Larissa on Instagram, she puts out some really great content, and it's been really great to see her sort of journey on social media. So I have a question for Lorien specifically. One thing we noticed when we were doing the Canadian City Parks report and we were reviewing climate resilience plans from cities across the country, we noticed that equity is often only mentioned in passing. And so it's very, very rarely implemented in sort of direct policies or actions. So how can cities begin to embed this climate justice lens into their work?
Thank you. That's a really excellent question. And I think the idea or the importance of equity and justice is something that's now starting to kind of bubble up, right? People are starting to realize this is important. And I think it's also something that's really new for cities, which is silly, right? I mean, like we've known this for a long time, but gradually we're starting to see cities acknowledge that justice and climate justice and environmental justice are important. And I know even sort of 5-10 years ago, we weren't seeing a lot of that. So I'm really happy to see that shift. At the same time, yeah, there's a lot of like sprinkling of the words equity and justice without actual action in that direction. And I think part of that is that sometimes it's not clear to people in sort of the day-to-day how they can action that. And part of that also, I think, is that it has to do with giving up power. And that can be hard for people to do and for people to see. And it's giving up some of that decision-making power that maybe you shouldn't even have had from the beginning, right? And so I guess let's think. One way in which, I guess the first step in terms of actioning climate justice for cities is to understand what some of the existing inequities are. And so cities are doing that, through mapping and stuff. Like City of Vancouver has identified these sort of priority zones where they're going to invest in green infrastructure or trees or parks as places that are particularly hot, particularly underserved, particularly low canopy. At the same time, that's still a bit of a paternalistic approach because it's the city kind of it's not giving up power, right? It's basically saying like, okay, we have the data, we're gonna do this analysis and we're gonna decide what's gonna happen. Some of those low canopy areas may not want more canopy, or they may not want it in the way that the city wants to provide it. And so I'll probably come back to this a lot, but I really think it starts with relationship building and trying to understand sort of what the needs and priorities are at a really fine-grained scale in different neighborhoods, in different communities within that neighborhood. So neighborhoods aren't always spatial; they're also sort of built around connections and culture. And so taking the time to work locally to understand what climate injustice looks like and what climate justice could look like is like the simple but complex path forward, I think. And the way that has been sort of actioned, or at least how people have started to action that in different jurisdictions, usually outside of Canada, is through something called Mosaic Governance, which allows different places to look different and to act differently and to behave differently, because we're not all the same across the city. We don't all, one city, especially a larger city like Toronto, for example, that's actually an amalgamation of all sorts of different communities, is not even going to have the same history in terms of how its built environment got to where it is, how its natural environment got to where it is. And so it can't have the same response to correcting past and current injustices. So really, I think taking the time and the space to create relationships of trust, to allow for discourse and just discussion, is really, I think, the only way forward that allows that partnership between the larger municipality and the local communities that are equity seeking. I've talked a long time, so there.
Great, thank you so much. And I really like how you brought up that concept of Mosaic governance. I actually stumbled upon this concept yesterday when I was reading one of your papers from 2018. And so for those of you who are on the line today, who maybe this is the first time you're hearing this, Mosaic governance is this idea of allowing a mosaic of governance approaches to sort of coexist and co-evolve in order to meet community needs and interests. And so what this might look like is something like an urban forestry plan that's not in place across the city, but exists on sort of like a sub-city scale in a ward or smaller sort of geographic scale. And this is a tool to sort of build active citizenship and capacity and community building. So I'm really glad you brought that up before I even got to it. Zamani.
Can I ask one thing about that? Mosaic governance, if people want examples, the city of Melbourne has started to work with that concept a bit. I'm not perfectly, but it's begun. So as you know, it can happen. And mosaics can be spatial, but I think they can also be sort of like networked almost. So I think people can think about mosaic governance in a really creative way. It doesn't have to just be like this neighborhood has this neighborhood has that, but more like maybe there's a way that governance operates with like youth in certain spaces, for example, that's different from people who are at other phases of their life. Like I think we can really use this concept to try and action diversity in governance. And I need to kind of think a bit more about that and hear other ideas, but I'm just trying to like not block my mind into a certain way of thinking about it because it's new. And so I think that it has a lot of potential. Yeah.
Thank you. Zamani, over to you. So for years, you've been doing incredible environmental education work, specifically with residents in social housing communities in order to improve their understanding of climate change and climate action, among many other topics. So what role does this education piece play in climate or environmental justice for you?
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephanie. So I think it's a great place to actually start. I think education is critical. When we work with residents, so I live in a Toronto community housing building. And for me, I realized very quickly that, we have really been conditioned into a way of being. So we're conditioned to just throw, if we're talking in the context of, let's say, waste management, we're just conditioned to throw things somewhere. We're conditioned to put all things in one place, And so I think that the education piece for, at least for my residents, was extremely critical so that one, I could introduce them to another way of using some old tools. So a lot of the, for example, the individuals that live here come from somewhere else. So, when they arrive here to Canada, not necessarily new immigrants, but definitely immigrants, right? And so there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of history, a lot of indigenous knowledge, I call some of my people land people. So a lot of people that live close to land in the places where they come from. So when you come here and you live in this sort of vertical community, it's a very different space. So the education piece around, helps us to sort of, I want to say maybe manage what the city's requests is of us as citizens who live here, and balance that with the needs of the community in order to be healthier and better and well and all those good things so that we can thrive, right? So I see the education as a way to, because we've been conditioned into a way of being, we can recondition ourselves out of that same way of being. So with the education thing, the education piece here, I think one of the things I found important is to provide incentives. And the more we can incentivize people to it's really just to open their mind's eye so that we can sort of learn and grow in a different direction. With SEED, that's what we really strive to do, is make sure that we're really opening people up to a different way of participating in environmental or climate action, right where they stand. So, for example, I used to work with a company called Green Saver, and one of the things that I found quite amazing is that the government provided these grants opportunities for people to, retrofit their homes so that they can save some money on, greenhouse, or save greenhouse gas emissions and make their home more energy efficient and all this great stuff. And then of course, those same folks probably have access to resources to be able to get an electric vehicle and, reduce their footprint and stuff like that. People who live in housing, that concept is not the same for us. We don't understand it in the same way. So the education piece would come in where we could let people know if we had incentives along those same kind of lines, or something that was really substantial for us that's worthwhile for us to make a shift in and do. I think that would be extremely helpful, and it would go quite a long way. So I think education is probably, that's why we focused on educating educating folks from, and we also made it culturally relevant. So whether you are an elder or you are a child, and everyone in between, no matter, regardless of whether you're a super or a staff that actually live here or staff that don't live here, because that makes a difference as well. It's so complex. We make sure we make space for everybody to learn from where they are at, which is it served us in a really powerful way. So I think that education is actually the critical piece to making that change sustainable and lasting. At least it has worked for us, and I see it working for many others as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate how you acknowledge this idea of sort of meeting people where they're at, because I think getting into, thinking about climate change as such an overwhelming topic, a lot of folks don't have necessarily a background or education in some of these more specific topics, and the concepts can be a little bit inaccessible. So yeah, I really appreciate that. So over to Larissa. As Larissa mentioned, I interviewed her earlier in 2021 for the Canadian City Parks Report for our story on environmental justice and climate resilience. And she talked about engaging with diverse youth and giving them decision-making power, as well as bringing in diverse experiences. So not always prioritizing people based on sort of academic or professional credentials, but widening our scope to sort of value the contributions of people with different lived experiences, including Indigenous land stewardship practices. And so when people talk about addressing inequities in parks, as we've mentioned a few times today, we often focus on distribution, right? So who has green spaces nearby and can therefore benefit from the resilience properties of trees and parks and all of that, and who doesn't have the ability to benefit from those spaces. But another element is around who's invited to participate in the planning and design and management of those spaces, and what does participation look like? So Larissa, how important is that sort of participation element when thinking about climate justice, and what does that look like for you?
I love that, Stephanie. You always have such insightful questions. Yeah, I think it's so important. And I'll just say that Future Ancestors Services, I started it with a few young professionals, and we had all worked in government. We had all worked in a lot of institutional spaces, and many of them informed urban planning and parks, municipal and provincial and national. So we'd all worked in all these spaces, and it was exhausting. We experienced so much trauma in these workplaces because we were constantly being told what you say doesn't matter, or it's not as important as what the scientists are saying right now, or because you're younger, we're going to demote you, pay you less, but we're actually going to make you do the most work because you have the most background in this subject. And we got really tired of it. So like, I think about this a lot. I've been personally affected by this so much in my career. And we constantly see clients doing this to their community members and their staff. And one of the big pieces I just want to say is that, again, we work a lot with government, we work a lot with urban planning, and a lot with parks. And so often we can't even get to the idea of talking about climate justice because of all the unaddressed racism that is held institutionally and has not been addressed within the people in the organization. So before I talk about all of what I'm just about to talk about, I think it's really important to highlight that only focusing on our work outputs and not how we're doing the work is not going to be revolutionary. We also have to be considering how we're doing that work. So I just want to note that. And again, I'm going to share my screen because I did some really interesting research a couple of years ago. I was in Yukon and I was able to speak with many community leaders and government officials. And it's just so fascinating what's happening in the North. And I think we really, as people who live in Southern Canada, we really need to look to the North for more inspiration and leadership, where we're seeing innovation in so many ways that we're unaware of because we just don't consider that Northern context. And so I've spent quite a bit of time in the North, and I've really gained an appreciation for how government and communities work together, especially because in those contexts, they often have to. There's no choice. If you don't work together, like your food supply is going to get cut off. And with such more extreme weather, you literally have no choice. And so it's really interesting, just the collaboration space that you see in Northern contexts because of the way that climate influences those needs for survival. And so I was there and I had a chance to interview Robin Bradash, and she had a leading role in the co-management regime that was developed in Kluane National Park. So there's a very violent history of Indigenous removal and First Nations people and their removal from that land in the 1970s. This was very traumatic. It was done very violently. And that trauma was held and is held intergenerationally. And so when they started inviting the First Nations back to the park and back to the land, many of the community members wouldn't go because of how traumatic those experiences of eviction were. And so from this kind of reality check was born a co-management regime. And Kluane National Park, I know this is national park and it's not cities park, but I want to underscore the significance of a co-management regime and looking at how we can be exploring what does this look like in parks, where in cities, sorry. What can this look like in cities? What can this look like if we engage and co-manage with the traditional caregivers of the land that this once and is? And so anyways, there's a quote from the interview I did with Robin. We were talking about reintroducing the original people to the park, and it was so frustrating to me that the scientists were not able to recognize that people have been removed and that had an impact, not only an impact on the land, but an impact on the people. There was such a lack of understanding around the true connection Indigenous peoples have with the land. This is relevant in city spaces. This is extremely relevant in city spaces. And I would love to see more discussion and more exploration around what a co-management regime can look like. Now, I've shared this article that I wrote for the Canadian Science Policy Center in 2019. And so it has more details on the specific co-management regime, some more resources. I'll share the link in the chat. But I'd love to see more co-management. And I think this is a way that we can be engaging in an authentic way and not doing engaging where we extract knowledge and then use it how we see fit, but where we develop actual partnerships where communities and the original caregivers of the land have power in decision-making. And I know that can feel really big to think about, but we've seen it happen and it's possible in what is currently Canada. So why not in cities? And so that's, and then to my last point, that kind of brings back to my contributions about climate justice. People's internalized racism. And I'm going to explain this because some people may not see this as being racist, but when we position our worldview as the only valid worldview and truth, so much harm comes from that when it's one worldview is positioned as being the only truth, and therefore any other worldviews are invalidated in comparison. And that's what I found in this research and working with the people and the proponents of this co-management regime is really naming that, acknowledging that, and then addressing it. Because Indigenous traditional knowledge is so important. It carries invaluable value. And the contributions are significant, and even something as simple as the way we regard an ecosystem. Western colonial culture has taught us to think of humans and even cities as separate from an ecosystem. We're not a part of many diagrams of ecosystems. But in different worldviews, in my cultural worldview, humans are a part of that ecosystem. And so when we start thinking part of the ecosystem, it changes the way that we think about strategy and planning and policy, changes the way we think about success. And it holds space for Indigenous traditional knowledge to carry power and value. And so that's kind of what I wanted to get at, especially the co-management piece. And getting back to like making sure we're contextualized, making sure that we acknowledge how certain worldviews were positioned as the unbiased truth, the only legitimate truth, and understanding that history of how traditional Indigenous knowledge has been systemically delegitimized. And co-management regimes and co-management efforts are one really concrete way that we can hold space to rectify that harm.
Can I just add to that? I really appreciate that you brought that up, Larissa. I grew up in the Northwest Territories in Nunavut, and so then I worked in sort of alliance with some Indigenous communities when I was an adult. And one of the reasons I think that a lot of the really interesting and fruitful co-management relationships exist in the North is because Northern Indigenous communities have done a lot of work to settle land claims that give them control over the land. And so there isn't an option. It's not like government decided to enter into a co-management relationship. They must. And so that may be an important part of setting that foundation in cities as well. Land ownership, land control, land governance is important. Then you have a partnership where you have two governing bodies or more that have to come to the table together to work on what's the solution. And then the other thing I think was really important about what you raised was the worldviews issue, right? And if you are in a co-management relationship or in a relationship where you want to move forward in a way that celebrates diversity, I think you need to be able to understand that just because you don't understand a worldview doesn't mean that it's not true. And even though it can look like it's in opposition to your own, it doesn't matter, it can still be true. And so just understanding that you don't have to validate someone else's worldview with your own. They can both be true at the same time, even if you don't see it, is important. And there's actual really like concrete examples of how that has worked out in the North well, and probably in other places as well. I'm just not as aware of it, but like, as an example, Northwest Territories government was working with Inuit organizations around trying to understand what was going on in a piece of land. And there was this, it seemed like there was a tension. Inuit people were saying, look, okay, like we understand why there was some salt damage. The details aren't really important, but because the Indigenous knowledge holders and the government scientists who were working together could kind of hold space for what seemed like conflicting understandings of the situation. Eventually they found out that they actually were saying the same thing. They just they weren't using a language that was speaking to each other, and they were both saying true things about the environment. But at first it seemed like a conflict. And so I guess I'm saying, like, don't shut down your mind. If someone's saying something that you don't understand, try to understand it. Yeah.
Actually, can I add to that too? So, wow, it's so powerful that we start with that conversation about worldview. that you brought up, Larissa. I think that's so on point. And then Lorien, when you start to talk about language, I think those two for me have been really a really important piece as well. I was giving a presentation sometime, I think it was in September, and I asked folks, when we say environment, give me examples of what of what environment is. So everyone listed all kinds of stuff. They said, the parks and trees, and they listed all these things, but no one said anything about your body as an environment. I mean, we are literally the earth, wind, water, and fire, right? And so having that disconnect for sure amplifies more of what you both are saying. And then the idea of language, I remember, so my grandmother, I'm but I was born in Jamaica. So my grandparents and my aunties and uncles and so on, most of them did a lot of farming and land work. So I call them land people. And so, I remember when I got introduced to this idea of compost, people talk about green bin and stuff like this. And so I was, I'm ready to learn. But I realized that when we talk about green bin or compost, this is something that, my grandparents and my mom and my aunties were doing a long time ago. So, that's why when we talk about at Seed, when we talk about making things culturally relevant, talking the language that we already know and using that same language in order to do what we need to do in this context, right? So I really love that those two connections. I think it's quite powerful and it's extremely necessary when we're talking about, if we're talking about anything going forward, being sustainable and being relevant, then I think you definitely and I think we are the ones to do it too. I don't think it's something that needs to be done by, needs to be sanctioned by any government, because we know we're here, we live and see what it looks like already, right? But I definitely think that us owning our own language and approaching it in the way that we already know, just in this context, I think that will really go a long way. So I appreciate the comments that the two of you made. That was great.
Thank you all so much for that. That was incredible. Yeah, Larissa, I see you have your hand raised if you want to jump in.
Sorry, I just want to really quickly, and I will just say, I have a brain bleed and the pressure in my head right now. I can't really read text on a screen right now, but I just noticed Sharon Lovett's question about non-human inhabitants on the land and bringing them into this idea of climate justice. And I just want to add it because it's a very quick add-on to this discussion we've just had about worldviews. A colonial Western worldview about, again, ecosystems and environment centers humans. It's human-centric. And that causes a lot of harm to the natural world and our non-human kinfolk. Simply addressing the issue of one worldview being positioned as the unbiased truth and opening space to incorporate not only Indigenous traditional knowledge from the land here, but acknowledging other Indigenous traditional knowledges as well that aren't maybe native to this land, but still hold value in teachings. And as Chick's point, bringing in these new settlers or people who've come here as migrants or refugees, holding space to bring those worldviews into consideration and into this idea of co-management or strategic planning. But as soon as we do that, we open the opportunities to hold space for a non-human kinfolk, because I can say very straightforwardly, pre-colonial cultures and post-colonial cultures that have retained so many of our indigenous traditions and practices, we've always honored our non-human kinfolk. It's never been that human-centric approach. And this is where opening up our tolerance and opening up the value for other worldviews, that we can address issues like wildlife losing out when we focus only on humans. So I just wanted to point to that question from Sharon and kind of from Chuck. Hey, Chuck, really quickly.
Thank you so much. There's so much more that I want to get into in this conversation, and I did have other questions prepared for the three of you that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to with just under 10 minutes remaining. So to wrap up, I'd like to hear from each of you. If you could take maybe 30 seconds to a minute to share an actionable step. So if people wanted to take action on climate justice in their own life or in their own communities, what can they take away from this conversation and what actions can they take? So maybe we'll go first with Zamani, then Lorien, and then Larissa to finish this off.
Well, thank you very much. Definitely a fruitful discussion. You might need a part two. But I would say initially just get involved in whatever way you can. You have a friend that says to me a long time ago, she said, just get in where you fit in, right? And so depending on what you have the ability to do, I think one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about today is time, right? And this kind of idea of who has time to actually participate in these kinds of discussions and conversations. So I think just finding a way to get in where you fit in. I also think that what's easy and palatable to do is to just listen. So if there are climate or environmental activities happening in your area, or if it's something you might even have a slight interest in, I think just listening would be really helpful. And recently, this year, I joined a group called Black Environmentalist Alliance. And for me, they have been a source of inspiration for me to continue to do the work that I want to do. We are a group of Black professionals who work in the environmental space, and we prioritize environmental justice. So I think that, finding a way to be inspired to continue to do the work that you'd like to do, I think that's important as well. And then lastly, I think, wherever you live, just be cognizant of the fact that, when we're asking, if you have community leaders coming to ask you to weigh in on something or participate, if you have the ability to do so, find a way to prioritize maybe, 10 minutes. It really can go a long way towards us making some lasting changes, but definitely just getting where you fit in. Yeah.
I don't know if I have much to add to getting where you fit in. That's really wise. Honestly, I think, I guess, building on what both Zamani and Larissa said, I guess one of the ways you might want to get in where you fit in, if it's right for you, is to try and find a relationship of stewardship with the trees and maybe other beings in your neighborhood. One of the ways that people can really help build climate justice and climate resilience is to do something simple like water a tree in the summer because it's dry, try and find a way to support the natural world that lives with us in a way that's close to your neighborhood, and help your neighbors and friends do the same. And I think people don't always realize that they can take care of the trees amongst us. They actually really need us to. The city can't do it all. The trees are just really underserved in our cities. And I think we can take steps to try and make them healthier.
Yeah, I love these. I'm gonna wrap up with getting where you fit in, but just really quickly, read history books, engage with history, know history. I've had a lifelong passion about human history, and it's helped me in so many ways that I never thought it would be, or it would, when I was reading that book. So read your history books. I really want to challenge everyone to read one that they think they'll agree with and one that may challenge their worldview. For me, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, I can never recommend that enough. And The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter is a really good book. And I learned a lot about the history of climate change and resource extraction from listening to that book. So read 2 history books. But then get in where you fit in. I think this is so important. I think as environmentalists and climate activists, we think we have to do everything. We have to do the work when we go into the office, metaphorically or physically. And then we also have to lead like a zero plastic lifestyle. And we also have to do very meticulous recycling and compost, like we have to do it all. And for me, I found a lot of healing and I found rest when I became okay compartmentalizing it a bit. And not to say that I don't recycle, not to say that I don't live an ethical life, but I recognize that the biggest impact that I'm making is where I fit in and what's accessible to me as someone who's disabled, as someone who's a single parent, and really just sitting and thinking about it and making an intentional contribution where I fit in, but not carrying the guilt for not being able to do that everywhere. So I love that message. I love that we all kind of resonated with that, because that's definitely where I wanted to go. And this has just been so inspiring to talk to you too, all three of you. I think this was a really powerful discussion.
Thank you so much for all of that. I did see some things pop up in the chat about, yeah, let's do a part 2. So obviously everyone here is super on board and super engaged with this conversation that we've had today. I really appreciate all the powerful insights you three have brought to our conversation today. And I know that this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I'm grateful we started these conversations with the three of you. I really like this exercise that Zara, the board chair at Park People, did during our last webinar, and I'd like to do the same today. So if all of you on the line could drop one word in the chat about how you're feeling, what you're taking away from this conversation, that would be incredible. That way our panelists can feel the energy and the passion and inspiration that has been generated here today. Just a few pieces to wrap up. Just sharing my screen quickly. So we want to invite you to join Park People from June 6th to June 29th for our 3rd annual national conference in 2022. It'll span 23 days and will bring together park professionals, community leaders, nonprofits, municipal staff, and urban enthusiasts through a hybrid event that will include in-person learning, tours, and networking events in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. It'll include dynamic and collaborative virtual sessions that will explore practical challenges and opportunities in city parks. So we really hope to see you there. So save the date. We definitely encourage you to stay in touch. I think Jake will put in the links to our newsletters. We put out great monthly newsletters to keep you up to date on upcoming opportunities and events, and to provide you with news and resources to keep you connected to the park issues that you care about. So use the link in the chat to make sure you're signed up to receive it. And it's a great way to stay in the loop about our national conference, including registering to attend when all of that is live. And be sure to check out more great Canada-wide park content on the Canadian City Parks Report website at ccpr.parkpeople.ca. And with that, I'd love to give a virtual round of applause to our 3 speakers. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and knowledge with us today. I've personally learned so much, and I'm going to take so much away from this conversation and look forward to staying connected with the 3 of you. And thanks to all of you for attending today's session, for your interest in parks and public spaces as a tool to address inequities in cities and as a space for connection and resilience. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.